Episode 1. Tamar. Betrayed, broken, but not forgotten. A righteous woman in a corrupt world. In a time when women were often silenced, controlled, and discarded, one woman's name carved itself into the eternal records of heaven, Tamar. Her story, tucked within the pages of Genesis 38, is not some clean-cut tale of virtue and victory. It is raw. It is real. It is riddled with scandal, loss, betrayal, and divine justice. Tamar's life was not marked by ease, nor was it written in the language of comfort. Hers was a life forged in the fires of humiliation, yet purified by the hand of God. She lived in a world ruled by men, where lineage meant power, and women were merely the vessels to carry it. Tamar was given in marriage to a man named the firstborn son of Judah, a patriarch of Israel. But was wicked, so wicked in fact that the Bible says God himself put him to death. Tamar was left a childless widow in a patriarchal society, vulnerable, voiceless, and at the mercy of a corrupt household. But this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning of God's intervention. This story is not here by accident. Genesis 38 seems at first to interrupt the grand narrative of Joseph and Egypt. But this chapter doesn't break the storyline, it anchors it. It shows us what God values in a world dripping with injustice. It's as if heaven itself slammed on the brakes and said, "Look at her, see this woman. Though man has failed her, I have not." Tamar's pain and patience were not forgotten. Her righteousness would become a weapon in the hands of divine justice. What makes this even more powerful is that Tamar wasn't just suffering silently, she was boldly righteous in a world of hidden sin. Her determination to preserve the name of her husband and her role in Judah's family line was not an act of desperation, it was an act of covenantal faithfulness. When everyone else abandoned God's law, she upheld it. When Judah, a son of Jacob, failed to walk in integrity, Tamar stepped into history with a courage that would shake generations to come. We read her story today and are tempted to reduce her to a symbol of seduction or controversy. But God saw something else entirely. God saw courage draped in widow's garments. God saw justice standing alone by the roadside, covered in a veil. God saw a mother in waiting, destined to birth a bloodline that would one day lead to the Messiah. The same Jesus Christ, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, would trace his lineage back to this woman the world tried to forget. Tamar's story is not simply one of survival. It is one of prophetic fulfillment. It's as though God planted a righteous seed in the soil of scandal and said, "Watch what I do with this." Her name appears in Matthew 1:3 among the sacred genealogy of Christ, not because of her scandal, but because of her faith, her boldness, her righteous defiance in the face of injustice. This isn't just an Old Testament footnote, it is a divine blueprint. A woman betrayed by men, broken by society, but remembered and elevated by God himself. Genesis 38 is not a pause in the Bible's story, it is a prophetic preview. The Messiah would not come through perfect men, but through broken women with righteous hearts. Tamar was betrayed. Tamar was broken, but Tamar was not forgotten. And neither are you. The failed lineage of Judah. Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, once walked with promise. He was meant to carry the legacy of Abraham forward, a royal bloodline forming through God's covenant. But in Genesis 38, we find Judah off course. He had left his brothers, married a Canaanite woman, and began raising sons with little spiritual oversight. His home, though prestigious, lacked righteousness. And into this broken household stepped a woman named Tamar. Judah gave his firstborn son, to Tamar in marriage. It was an arranged union, as was customary in those days. On the surface, It seemed like a blessing, marriage into a notable lineage. But this was no dream come true. The Bible doesn't mince words. It says plainly, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. Genesis 38:7. That's all we're told. No details, no redemption, no last-minute repentance. Just divine judgment. His sin was so grave that God himself stepped in and ended his life. Tamar was suddenly a widow, young, childless, and thrust into a household plagued by moral collapse. Under God's law, there was a solution: the custom of levirate marriage. Judah was responsible to ensure that Tamar bore a son in her late husband's name to preserve the family line. That duty now passed to Onan, Judah's second son. Outwardly, Onan accepted the role. Inwardly, he rejected it. He took Tamar as his wife, but refused to fulfill his obligation. He used her body, but denied her purpose. The scripture says Onan spilled his seed on the ground. Genesis 38:9, to avoid giving Tamar a child who would not carry his own name. His actions weren't just selfish, they were a direct insult to God's justice. And once again, God acted. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, wherefore he slew him also. Genesis 38:10. 2 sons dead, 2 strikes against Judah's house. And Tamar, still barren, still waiting, still believing. The lineage of Judah was unraveling, not because of Tamar, but because of his own sons. Tamar was not the curse. She was the mirror reflecting the spiritual decay inside Judah's line. Yet despite this, she held her ground. She did not run, she did not curse God. She remained faithful to her covenant and quietly committed to her place in the plan of redemption. What's powerful here is not just that Tamar endured the deaths of 2 husbands, it's that she endured spiritual abandonment. Judah, instead of honoring the law and comforting Tamar, began to fear her. He viewed her as a threat rather than a victim. Superstition clouded his judgment. He suspected that she was cursed, unaware that it was his household steeped in sin. He promised Tamar his 3rd son, Shelah, but secretly had no intention of fulfilling that vow. Tamar was once again left with a promise and a lie. But through it all, Tamar remained faithful, not to Judah, not to or Onan, but to God's justice. She could have walked away. She could have accepted defeat. But she understood something deeper, that God was not finished with her. Though the house of Judah was crumbling, she still believed there was purpose in her pain. This wasn't just about having a child. This was about preserving a divine promise. Tamar wasn't trying to manipulate the system. She was trying to protect the covenant that the men in her life had forsaken. She didn't seek revenge. She sought righteousness. 2 husbands gone, 2 sons silenced by God. But Tamar, she was still standing, still childless, but not faithless, deceived and forgotten. Time is a cruel master when it's filled with silence. For Tamar, silence wasn't just the absence of words, it was the absence of justice. She had done all that was required of her. She entered Judah's household with obedience. She submitted to the law. She endured the death of 2 husbands. And now she waited for a promise Judah had made but never intended to keep. Judah, after losing 2 sons, looked at Tamar not through eyes of compassion, but through the lens of fear. Superstition gripped him. He began to whisper in his heart, "She is cursed." In his pain and pride, he blamed Tamar for what was truly the judgment of God upon his sons. But rather than examine his own household, he shifted the burden to her. And so he promised her the youngest son, Shelah, saying, "Remain a widow at thy father's house, till my son Shelah be grown." Genesis 38:11. But the promise was a lie. Tamar obeyed once again. She took off the garments of a wife and clothed herself in widow's robes. She returned to her father's house, not with joy, but with resolve. She waited. Day turned into week, week into months, months into years. Sheila grew into a man. Tamar watched from a distance, watched as Judah's family celebrated feasts, harvested fields, planned marriages, but not hers. No messenger came. No preparations were made. No ceremony was offered. Her womb remained empty, and her soul, though bruised, was still upright. Judah had moved on. His house had moved on. But Tamar had not forgotten. Every day she wrapped herself in garments of mourning, not because she clung to the past, but because the future that was promised to her had been stolen. She was a living symbol of injustice, a woman trapped in mourning, not by death, but by betrayal. And yet, she waited. Others would have cursed God. Others would have sought revenge. But Tamar remained still, alert, and faithful. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was patience under pressure. She wore her widowhood like armor. It reminded her of what she had endured and what she still hoped for. Not hope in man, but hope in the God who sees all. Because while Judah forgot, God did not. He saw every tear Tamar shed behind the veil. He heard every breath of disappointment. He witnessed every day she walked past wedding songs that weren't hers. And he wrote it all down. Heaven does not ignore the cries of the righteous, even when men do. It's important to understand what Tamar was really fighting for. This wasn't about romance. This wasn't about personal vindication. This was about covenant. The promise of a child in her late husband's name was more than a family tradition. It was tied to the legacy of the Messiah. Tamar wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing in the gap for a future generation that would one day bring salvation to the world. And Judah? He went on with life. He protected Sheila, not for righteousness, but for selfishness. He had no intention of giving Tamar what was rightfully hers. In his eyes she was forgotten, an unpleasant memory, an inconvenience buried in distance and time. But God was preparing a different story. In the silence of Tamar's tent, purpose was taking root. In her waiting, God was writing a chapter that would shake generations to come. She had been deceived by Judah. She had been forgotten by man. But she was held in the hand of God. The world moved on, but Tamar remembered, and more importantly, so did God. A bold, risky plan. Tamar had waited long enough. She had worn the garments of widowhood. She had endured shame, silence, and years of broken promises. But the moment came when patience gave way to boldness, not bitterness, but courage rooted in righteousness. Word came to her. Judah was going to Timnath to shear his sheep. A festival, a time of celebration. A father who had forgotten her, now within reach. Tamar knew what she must do. The law had failed her, the family had forsaken her, but the God of justice had not. She took off her widow's garments, the very symbol of her mourning, and in their place she dressed in the garments of a prostitute, not to seduce, not to defile, but to defend the legacy that Judah was destroying through cowardice and deceit. She wrapped her veil tight around her face, her identity hidden, her purpose clear. She made her way to the gate of Enaim, a place along the road Judah would pass. And there, as the sun dipped below the horizon and twilight kissed the dust, Tamar waited, alone, exposed, vulnerable, but fierce, with a quiet fire that only heaven could see. And then Judah came. He didn't recognize her. To him, she was just another nameless woman by the roadside, a stranger to satisfy the desires of the flesh. He approached her with an offer, not of marriage, not of restoration, but of a goat, the price of temporary pleasure. She responded not with refusal, but with strategy. "What will you give me as a pledge until the goat arrives?" she asked. He offered his signet, his cord, and his staff. Judah didn't realize what he was doing. But heaven did. He was handing Tamar the very symbols of his authority, his identity, his name, his honor, and in exchange, he laid with the woman he had abandoned, unknowingly sowing seed into the very womb he had cursed. It wasn't lust that drove Tamar. It was legacy. She was not after revenge. She was after redemption. The house of Judah was broken, but the promise of God could not be broken with it. Tamar was not trying to manipulate the system. She was fulfilling the justice that Judah refused to honor. That night, a divine seed was planted, not just in her womb, but in the timeline of redemption. The woman cast aside was now the vessel of covenant. The line of the Messiah had been preserved, not by the righteousness of a man, but by the bravery of a forgotten woman. Tamar returned home in silence. She removed the veil, put back on her widow's garments, and waited. This time, not in despair, but in certainty. She had done what needed to be done. She had not stepped outside the law. She had stepped into a moment where divine justice overruled human corruption. Judah had no idea what had just happened. To him, it was a casual encounter, a secret he could bury. But God had marked that night, not with shame, but with destiny. Tamar risked everything, her name, her safety, her future. But what she gained was far more than survival. She gained a place in the lineage of kings. She gained a place in the story of the Messiah. And that night, hidden beneath a veil, surrounded by silence, a flame of prophetic purpose ignited in her womb. Destiny had taken root. The scandal and the showdown. 3 months had passed. The silence in Judah's household had returned to normal. At least, that's what he thought. The memory of the woman by the roadside had faded into the shadows of secrecy. Judah continued his life, unaware that the very act he had committed in darkness was about to be dragged into the light. Then came the word, "Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot. And also, behold, she is with child by whoredom." Genesis 38:24. Judah's reaction was immediate, not thoughtful, not merciful, not humble, but furious. "Bring her forth and let her be burned," he shouted. No trial, no investigation, no compassion, just condemnation. The man who had withheld justice now demanded punishment. The man who had used a woman in secret now sought to destroy her in public. His hypocrisy was louder than his holiness. The crowd gathered quickly. Whispers turned to gasps, faces turned from curiosity to horror. A woman, pregnant out of wedlock, guilty of betrayal to the house of Judah, it was an offense worthy of death. Or so Judah believed. But Tamar had come prepared. She did not scream, she did not beg, she did not expose him with anger or vengeance. Instead, she reached into her garments and pulled out 3 sacred items, a staff, a cord, and a signet ring. Calmly but with purpose, she said, "By the man to whom these belong, I am with child." She looked Judah in the eye. "Discern, I pray thee, whose are these?" And in that moment, the earth stood still. Judah's heart froze, his mind raced, his soul trembled. The staff, his. The cord, his. The signet, unmistakably, his. The crowd turned to him, eyes wide, mouths open. Murmurs rippled through the courtyard like thunder rolling across dry land. Tamar's righteousness had exposed Judah's guilt. She had not committed adultery. She had not played the harlot. She had only claimed what was rightfully hers. the justice denied to her by the very man who now stood in shame. Judah could not hide. He could not escape. And for the first time in this entire story, he repented. He said aloud, before all, "She hath been more righteous than I, because I gave her not to Shelah my son." Genesis 38:26. It was a confession not just of sin, but of failure. He had failed Tamar. He had failed the law. He had failed the legacy of his father Jacob. But Tamar's boldness had forced the truth into the open. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a divine confrontation. Judah had tried to bury Tamar, but God used her to resurrect righteousness. She stood as a living testimony that justice, though delayed, could never be denied when heaven ordains it. Tamar didn't burn in flames. Instead, she stood in victory. The woman everyone wanted to forget had become the woman no one could ignore. And as the people slowly dispersed, humbled and silent, Judah walked away, not as a conqueror, but as a convicted man, forever changed. Tamar, once branded with disgrace, now carried something far more powerful in her womb, the next chapter in the story of redemption. What man tried to condemn, God chose to honor, and the one who was nearly burned would soon birth a flame that would light the path to the Messiah. Episode 6. Legacy. Born through fire. From ashes came life. From shame came glory. From a scandal came the seed of salvation. Tamar, once cast aside, once threatened with fire, was now carrying the fire of legacy within her. Her womb, once empty and forgotten, had become the sacred chamber of God's justice and fulfillment. She would not bear just one child, but two. Twins, a double portion of promise, a prophetic echo of the struggle that began with Jacob and Esau, now being rewritten through a woman the world once dismissed. As the day of birth arrived, the midwives gathered. There was tension, there was uncertainty, and then there was life. The first child's hand emerged from the womb. The midwife quickly tied a scarlet thread around it, saying, "This one came out first." But suddenly the hand was pulled back in, and the second child burst forth first instead. He pushed ahead, broke through. The midwife cried out in awe, "How hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee." Genesis 38:29. And so he was named Phares, meaning breakthrough. The second child, the one with the scarlet thread, came out afterward. He was named Zara, meaning brightness or rising. Two sons, one legacy, and a future that would shake history to its core. Phares the younger, who came out first, would become the ancestor of King David, the man after God's own heart. And from David, in the fullness of time, would come the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Son of the living God, Jesus Christ. Tamar, the so-called harlot, the curse, the woman condemned by men, became a matriarch in the bloodline of the Messiah. Her name is recorded in Matthew 1:3, the royal genealogy of Jesus, written for all the world to see. Her story was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be immortalized, proof that God does not write people off the way men do. Judah, who once sought her death, now stood humbled. He had seen righteousness walk in through the door he had locked, and he had been changed. He never touched her again. He never tried to manipulate her again. He recognized that Tamar had upheld the honor of his household when he himself had forsaken it. Through Tamar's pain came prophetic birth. Through her courage came covenantal restoration. And through her breakthrough came the line of the deliverer. It's no accident that the one who came out first was not the one expected. Phares, the one without the scarlet thread, the one who forced his way out, represents how God often chooses the unlikely, the overlooked, the misunderstood to carry his greatest purposes. Tamar's fire burned silently for years, but when it ignited, it consumed shame and gave birth to royalty. Her tent of mourning became a house of praise. Her rejection became revelation, and her womb became a holy gateway through which God would usher in the King of Kings. Tamar was not just vindicated, she was elevated. She bore the pain, she bore the shame, and then she bore the promise. And through her, God sent a message to every woman, every outcast, every forgotten soul. You are not invisible. I see you. I choose you. I will birth greatness through you. From betrayal to breakthrough, from silence to song, from ashes to eternal glory. Episode 7. The message that echoes today. Generations have passed. Kingdoms have risen and fallen. Names forgotten. Monuments turned to dust. But Tamar's name lives on, not as a footnote, but as a flame. Why? Because her story wasn't just written in scrolls. It was written in bloodlines, in prophecy, and in the heart of every soul who's ever been overlooked, lied to, or left behind. Tamar's journey wasn't about cultural relevance, it was about eternal significance. Tamar didn't start as royalty. She was a foreigner, a woman with no power in a patriarchal system, a daughter-in-law, a widow, a victim of silence. She was betrayed, discarded, and forgotten. But she remembered the promise. She held on when others let go. And she stepped into her destiny when others expected her to disappear. Tamar was not loud, but her faith thundered. She was not crowned, but her courage was royal. She was not honored by men, but she was chosen by God. Her story is more than ancient history. It's your story. To the woman watching who's been blamed for what wasn't her fault, Tamar speaks. To the one who's been overlooked by leaders, forgotten by family, abandoned by those who made promises they never intended to keep, Tamar stands with you. To every person who's ever worn the garments of grief while others celebrated without you, who has sat alone staring into the horizon, wondering if God remembers your name, Tamar is your testimony. She whispers to the weary, "Don't give up. What men bury, God resurrects. What Judah dismissed, God honored. What the world labeled scandal, heaven called sacred. What seemed like a mistake was actually messianic design. And let this truth shake your spirit. Tamar didn't just survive, she shaped the destiny of the world. Her son Pharez didn't become a footnote, he became the foundation of the lineage that birthed Jesus Christ. The Messiah didn't come from kings and perfection. He came from a line that included scandal, sorrow, and strong women who refused to be erased. Tamar reminds us that God's story isn't reserved for the flawless. He writes beauty out of brokenness. He pulls eternal purpose from what others throw away. And if you've ever questioned your worth, look at Tamar. She had no temple, no crown, no title, but she had faith. And God took her pain and birthed a promise. Her name appears in Matthew chapter 1 among only 4 women in the genealogy of Christ. She doesn't just appear, she stands tall. Proof that God values the righteous who stand when others fall. Proof that legacy isn't passed through comfort, but through courage. So today, as you look into your mirror, don't just see yourself. See Tamar. See the woman who waited. See the woman who fought righteously. See the woman who held her ground when others fled. See the woman God chose to carry the future of the world. And let her voice echo through your soul. If God remembered me, He will remember you. If God chose me, He will raise you up. If destiny found me on a dusty road, then surely your breakthrough is coming too. Her story ends with twins in her arms, but it begins again every time someone refuses to be forgotten, refuses to settle, and refuses to let go of God's promise. This isn't just Tamar's legacy anymore, it's yours.